I have spent most of my adult life rushing through the streets of Rome in the back of an ambulance, sirens cutting through the chaos, answering calls where seconds often decide between life and death. My name is Luca. I'm 38, a paramedic who thought he had seen everything a city could show. Accidents on the cobblestones, tourists collapsing in the heat, neighbors crying out from windows. I was trained to be calm, steady, professional. But what I stumbled upon that evening stripped away every layer of distance I thought I had built. I was walking home through a narrow alley just past the Colosseum's shadow when I noticed what looked like a crumpled paper bag wedged against the base of an old stone wall. People drifted by without a second glance. Rome is full of discarded things, after all. I almost kept moving too, until I caught a flicker, the faintest twitch that didn't belong to something lifeless. I stopped, leaned closer, and the sinking realization hit me. The bag was breathing. Inside the shadows, pressed against the cold stone, lay a tiny French Bulldog puppy, no more than 3 months old. His body curled tightly as if the world was too big, his coat stained with dust and grease. I could see ribs lifting and falling under thin fur, each breath shallow, fragile, nearly lost in the noise of scooters roaring past. His eyes lifted to meet mine, and for a moment they held me there. Not with a bark or whimper, but with the heavy silence of a creature who had learned too early not to expect kindness. The street smelled of damp pavement, old wine spilled from a bottle, exhaust from passing cars. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses floated from the piazza nearby, life carrying on as if this little soul didn't exist. My hand hovered above him, trembling, not knowing if he would try to crawl deeper into the cracks or if he was too weak to resist. My heart beat louder than the city itself. I whispered, barely daring to breathe, "You're still here." In that instant, everything else fell away. The landmarks, the crowd, the noise of Rome. There was only this fragile body, half in shadow, half in fading light, and me kneeling in the dust, unable to walk past. I didn't yet know what would come next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't leave him behind. I leaned closer, ready to see if hope was still strong enough in him to let me near. I crouched lower, the rough stone scraping against my knees, and spoke softly into the air, as if words alone might bridge the impossible distance between us. The puppy's ears twitched, not in trust, but in that instinctive flinch of something that has been hurt too many times before. His body remained pressed into the corner, a tiny statue of fear and exhaustion. I remembered the countless times I had reached for injured strangers on the streets of Rome, the trembling hands I had steadied, the frightened eyes I had reassured, but this was different. This little one had no words, no way to understand why I was there. Only survival kept him frozen. I eased my hand closer, inch by inch, the way I might calm a patient in shock. My fingers brushed the air just above his fur, and the smell reached me first. Damp dust, sour neglect, the faint trace of something spoiled. His coat was gritty beneath my fingertips when I finally dared to touch him. He shivered violently, not with cold, but with that desperate resistance to trust. And then, almost as if he realized he had no strength left to fight, he stilled. I could feel each rib sharp against my palm, the fragile rise and fall of his breathing. The city moved around us, oblivious. A group of tourists passed, cameras clicking, their laughter echoing off the stone walls, never noticing what lay in the shadows. A scooter rattled by, the driver weaving through the alley as if this moment, this fragile life, was invisible. And maybe to everyone else it was. But to me, in that moment, he was the only thing in Rome that mattered. I whispered again, trying to give him a sound to hold on to. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." My voice cracked in a way it never did when I stood in uniform with gloves and equipment. This was raw, personal. I wasn't just a paramedic. I was a man with his hand on a trembling puppy who looked like he had been discarded by the world. When I slid my arms carefully beneath him, he tensed once more, but there was no fight. His small body was shockingly weightless, as if I had lifted nothing more than a bundle of rags. Yet the warmth of him against my chest told me he was still here, still holding on. I pressed him close, shielding him from the wind that swept down the alley. For the first time, I felt his nose nudge weakly against my shirt, a gesture so faint I almost thought I imagined it. I rose slowly, the sounds of Rome swelling back around me. Ancient walls, neon signs, laughter, and smoke, the eternal city carrying on while I cradled a piece of life that had almost slipped through its cracks. I didn't know if he would survive the night, but as I stepped out of the shadows, I knew I had already made my choice. His weight against my chest was almost nothing, frightening in its fragility. Each step I took through the narrow streets made me more aware of just how broken he was. I looked down and the sight hollowed me out. His fur wasn't just dirty, it was matted into clumps, strands glued together with dried mud and greasy patches that left my hands gritty after a single touch. Around his neck, the coat was so thin it looked chewed away, exposing pink skin rubbed raw. Tiny clots of dirt clung to his paws, and when I shifted him in my arms, flakes of dried grime fell away like ash. He smelled of old stone, damp cardboard, and something sour that spoke of too many nights spent pressed into filthy corners. Every shallow rise of his ribs seemed to push the mess of his coat outward, like he was fighting his way out of the dirt itself. I had seen malnourished men after long nights of accidents, but never had I held something so frail. His belly was gaunt, his frame sharp under my palms. When I brushed a thumb along his ear, it came away stained, as if the city itself had left its mark on him. I whispered to him, not sure if I was speaking to keep him calm or to quiet the panic clawing in my chest. "Stay with me, Piccolo. Stay with me." His ears flicked once, a faint sign that he heard me, though his eyes drifted closed again, the lashes clumped with grit. A woman sweeping her doorway looked up as I passed, pausing mid-motion. Her eyes lingered on the bundle in my arms, on the shivering, dirt-streaked body pressed against my shirt. For a moment, her broom stilled, the bristles resting against the cobblestones as if she understood. But then she turned back to her work, the scrape of straw against stone fading behind me. I pressed him closer, my jaw tightening as flakes of hardened mud rubbed off on my clothes. He was falling apart in my hands, a creature swallowed by the grime of neglect, and still. His nose twitched faintly against my chest, searching for warmth. His coat may have been ruined, his little body weak and filthy, but something in him was refusing to let go. By the time I reached the edge of the piazza, his breathing came shallow and fast, each exhale rattling against the cage of his ribs. My heart hammered as I quickened my pace. The dirt clinging to him was more than a mess. It was a weight pulling him down. And I swore to myself then he wouldn't be left to rot in that filth, not while he still had breath in him. I carried him through the maze of streets as though every uneven stone beneath my shoes could be the one that jolted him past his fragile edge. His body was so small against me, yet the weight of him felt enormous. Dirt crumbled from his coat with every step, falling in little trails onto the cobblestones, marking where we had been. His paws were stiff and caked with hardened mud, little claws dull and chipped, as if he had clawed at walls or boxes to no avail. When I brushed a hand along his back, it came away smeared in a greasy film, and the thought of how long he must have lain in filth made my chest ache. The clinic wasn't far, but the distance stretched like miles. Each shallow breath he took sounded fragile, and I couldn't stop myself from checking him every few steps, pressing my palm gently against his chest to feel that rhythm still there. He made no sound, no whimper or bark, only the faint tremor of his body when a cold gust whipped down the alley. I whispered to him again and again, words that tumbled out without thought. "Hold on, little one. Just a little longer. You're not alone anymore." When the small neon cross of the veterinary clinic finally came into view, relief rushed through me so sharply it almost hurt. I pushed through the glass door, and the sudden quiet inside felt unreal after the city's noise. The receptionist looked up, startled, and her eyes widened at the sight of what I carried. "Subito," she called softly, and disappeared through a door before I could answer. A young vet in a white coat came quickly, motioning me to follow. His face, usually calm in my past visits when I'd brought in neighborhood strays, tightened at the sight of the puppy in my arms. He gestured toward the metal table, and for a moment I hesitated, afraid that laying him down might break whatever fragile thread was keeping him here. But I knew I had to. Gently, I lowered him onto the cold surface. He lay limp, his legs splayed awkwardly, too weak to tuck them beneath him. Clumps of dirt and flakes of dried mud scattered across the steel as his body touched it. The vet pressed his stethoscope against the tiny chest, brows furrowed, listening with a silence that seemed to stretch forever. I stood frozen, my hands hovering above the puppy as though I could shield him from everything, even the truth. Finally, the vet looked at me. "He's very weak," he said quietly, in that measured tone I knew too well from my own work. "But there's still fight in him." The puppy's eyes flickered open, just for a moment, and I saw it. Not trust, not yet, but a spark. A stubborn glimmer that refused to go out. My throat tightened, and I gripped the edge of the table, whispering under my breath. "Then we fight together." The metallic chill of the exam table seeped into my hands as I steadied him, afraid that without my touch he might slip away. The vet moved quickly, his hands firm but gentle, pulling out instruments, shining a small light into the puppy's eyes, parting the matted fur around his ears. Each time the fur was lifted, more filth was revealed. Clumps of hardened dirt breaking loose, flakes of skin where the grime had rubbed him raw. His little paws trembled when the vet touched them, nails worn down, pads cracked and blackened with residue that looked like it had been there for weeks. I watched as he drew a small syringe, my chest tightening. "Just fluids," the vet murmured in Italian, glancing at me as if to calm my fear. The tiny needle slipped beneath the loose skin at the back of his neck, and for the first time, the puppy made a faint sound. A weak, breathy whine, so quiet it barely reached my ears. My heart twisted at the sound, and I whispered back instantly, "Shh, Piccolo, I'm here." My hand rested against his head, and though his eyes didn't lift, he leaned ever so slightly into my palm, as if holding on to the warmth. The vet cleaned around his mouth, dipping gauze into water and wiping away layers of dried saliva, grime, and tiny particles of dirt. With each stroke, the true color of his fur began to peek through, pale fawn where it had been hidden beneath gray. I realized then how little I had seen of him, how much of his small body had been buried beneath neglect. His belly was so thin it curved inward, but when the vet placed a small dish of water near his muzzle, something miraculous happened. His dry tongue flicked out once, then again, and with effort he lapped. The sound was faint, fragile, but to me it was thunder, proof that life still pulsed inside him. I couldn't look away. Every detail etched into me. The way droplets clung to his chin, the tremor in his legs as if drinking demanded too much energy, the soft hum of the clinic's fluorescent lights above us. I found myself breathing in rhythm with him, as if tethering my own life to his. The vet finally looked up, his voice low but steady. "He's not out of danger. Tonight will be difficult. If he makes it through, he has a chance." Those words hung in the air like a verdict. I pressed my hand more firmly against the puppy's head, feeling the faint heat of his body beneath the dirt and the band of fluids just under his skin. He was fighting, even in this fragile state. And I knew in that instant that no matter how hard the night ahead might be, I wasn't leaving his side. As the vet stepped away to prepare more supplies, I leaned close to the little one, my whisper steady despite the tremor in my chest. "We'll get through the night together. I promise." That night in the clinic felt endless, each minute dragging like an hour as I sat beside him, unwilling to close my eyes. The fluorescent light above us buzzed faintly, casting its pale glow over the room, while outside Rome went on without us. Scooters, laughter, glasses clinking in trattorias, a world that seemed impossibly distant from the stillness here. The little French Bulldog lay wrapped in a thin blanket the vet had given me, his body curled but slack, every shallow rise of his ribs reminding me how close he stood to the edge. I stroked the fur along his head gently, feeling the grit and tangles beneath my fingers, still unable to smooth them away. His coat gave off that sour, heavy odor of neglect, a smell that clung to my clothes, but I couldn't bring myself to pull back. He twitched sometimes, a small spasm running through his legs, as if his body was remembering struggle even in sleep. When I whispered to him, his ears would flick faintly, a tiny sign that my voice was reaching him. The vet came in and out through the night, checking his vitals, adjusting the fluids that dripped slowly into his fragile body. Each time, I searched his face for answers, and each time the only words he gave me were soft, careful, still holding on. It wasn't enough to settle my fear, but it was enough to keep me anchored. Hours blurred together. I found myself speaking to him in fragments, as if the words themselves could stitch him more firmly to life. I told him about my ambulance shifts, about the chaos of the city, about the people I had carried through their worst nights. I admitted, in a voice I barely recognized, that this felt harder than any of it, sitting helpless while a small creature fought for each breath. At one point, his eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time since I had found him, his gaze lingered on me. Not just a glance, not just a flicker of instinct, but a fragile meeting of eyes. His pupils were dull, ringed with exhaustion, but there was something behind them, something I could only describe as a question. My throat tightened, and I whispered back, "Yes, I'm here. I won't leave." He closed his eyes again, his nose twitching against the blanket, and I held his tiny body closer, cradling him as though my warmth alone might tip the balance. Outside, dawn began to creep in, soft light seeping through the edges of the blinds, carrying the promise of another day. I leaned my head against the edge of the table, exhaustion finally pulling at me, and listened to the faint rhythm of his breathing. It was weak, it was fragile, but it was there. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe he might see the morning. The pale light of morning filtered through the blinds, turning the clinic's white walls a soft gold, and I realized I had been awake the entire night, my body aching from the hard chair. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the sound I heard, faint, uneven but steady, his breathing. The little French Bulldog had made it through the night. When the vet entered, his shoes clicking softly against the tiles, I almost didn't dare look up, afraid that hope was just something I had invented to keep myself going. He leaned over the table, listening to the fragile chest with his stethoscope, and then glanced at me. "He's weak, but he's stronger than yesterday." The words felt like air after drowning. I watched as the vet set a shallow dish of softened food near his nose. For a long moment, nothing happened. He lay curled, still wrapped in the blanket, his head too heavy to lift. I whispered to him, leaning close, letting my voice brush against his ear. "Try, Piccolo. Just a little." His nose twitched, the faintest movement, and then slowly, he stretched his neck toward the bowl. His tongue flicked out once, uncertain, then again, and suddenly he was eating, clumsy, shaky bites, but eating all the same. Tears blurred my vision before I could stop them. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing, a sick puppy nibbling a little mush from a dish. But to me, it was everything. Each mouthful was defiance, a declaration that he wasn't ready to give up. Bits of softened food stuck to his chin, mixing with the grime of his fur, and I wiped them gently away with a corner of the blanket. He leaned into my hand, just slightly, the first sign of trust I had felt since I found him. As the city outside began to stir, church bells tolling, scooters revving, shop shutters clattering open, we stayed in that small, quiet room, locked in a moment that felt suspended between life and loss. He was still filthy, his coat tangled and patchy, ribs showing sharply beneath the fur. But there was life in him now, undeniable and stubborn. I reached out, letting my fingers brush under his chin. His head rested there for a second, heavier than before, as if he was finally willing to share the weight of survival with me. And in that fragile surrender, I felt it. We weren't just fighting for his life anymore. We were starting to step toward belonging. I leaned closer, my voice steady, low. "You're safe, little one. We're going to see this through." And for the first time, his tiny tail gave the faintest twitch against the blanket. Not much, barely more than a shadow of a movement. But it was enough to break my heart wide open. By the second morning, something inside me had shifted. The fear was still there, always humming beneath the surface, but it was joined now by a fragile thread of hope. The little French Bulldog lay bundled in a fresh towel, his tiny body still thin, still smeared with stubborn patches of grime that even gentle washing hadn't yet erased. But his eyes, those heavy, weary eyes, stayed open longer now. They followed me when I moved, as though he was beginning to anchor himself, not just to survival, but to me. The vet had given me the go-ahead to take him home for the first time, warning me in measured tones that he would still need constant care. I carried him through the waking streets of Rome, the air filled with the scent of fresh coffee and warm bread from the bakeries. For once, the chaos of scooters and voices didn't feel intrusive. It felt like the city was breathing with us, as if each sound of life mirrored the pulse I felt beneath my hands when I held him. Back in my small apartment near Trastevere, I laid him gently on a pile of soft blankets I had hurriedly arranged before leaving for the clinic. He sank into them with a sigh, his body curling, but this time not with the stiff tension of fear. He looked up at me, his face still streaked with dirt around the muzzle, patches of fur sticking out in uneven clumps, and I couldn't hold back a smile. I warmed water in a basin, my hands trembling as I dipped the cloth and wrung it out. Each stroke across his coat revealed the slow transformation, the pale cream of his fur emerging in streaks where only gray filth had been. He blinked slowly, the corners of his eyes softening, his breathing steady. He even tilted his head into the cloth as I wiped along his ears, as if he had discovered at last that touch didn't have to mean harm. When I finished, I wrapped him in a clean towel and held him against my chest. His smell lingered, still musty, still tainted with the weight of neglect, but beneath it there was something warmer now, something living. He pressed his nose into the fabric of my shirt, the way he had that first night, but this time it wasn't just a flicker of instinct. It felt like a choice. I whispered to him, my voice catching in my throat. "You deserve more than survival, Piccolo. You deserve a name." And as I spoke, I felt the faint rhythm of his tail against my arm again, not just once, but twice, like an answer. It was the smallest gesture, yet it filled the quiet room with a sense of beginning, as though the past he had been buried under was loosening its hold, making space for something new. I filled the basin in my small bathroom slowly, the sound of water rushing against porcelain echoing louder than it should have in the tight space. He sat bundled in the towel on the floor beside me, blinking up with wary eyes that followed every movement. His tiny French Bulldog body, still only 3 months old, looked smaller than ever against the tiles, ribs showing sharply, patches of dirt stubbornly clinging to his coat no matter how many times I wiped him. I could smell him even from where I knelt, the sour mix of neglect, sweat, and dust baked into his skin. "Easy, Piccolo," I whispered, sliding my arms beneath him. He stiffened, the instinct of fear rising, but when I pressed him close against my chest, he didn't resist. His heart beat fast, fluttering like a trapped bird, but it was steady. I lowered him toward the water, his paws twitching as if he didn't know whether to fight or surrender. The moment his pads touched the warm surface, he jerked, a faint whimper escaping. I held him firm but gentle, letting the warmth wrap around him. At first he trembled, his whole body rigid, as though the water itself was another threat. I cupped my hand and let the liquid trickle over his back, carrying with it the filth of the streets. Dark streaks swirled into the basin, the grime breaking apart and floating away like shadows leaving his skin. His fur, once matted and greasy, began to soften under my touch. Slowly, his trembling eased. His nose lifted toward me, eyes half closed, and he let out a long, shaky sigh. I rubbed gently behind his ears, where dirt had caked in tight clumps, until pale fur emerged beneath. His little paws, once stiff with dried mud, spread out in the water, claws dull but no longer hidden under filth. I couldn't stop the tears from burning my eyes. It felt less like washing and more like uncovering him, piece by piece, from the prison of neglect he had carried. When I lifted him out, dripping and fragile, I wrapped him in a fresh towel and pressed him close. He smelled different now, faintly of soap, of warmth, of something new. His fur still patchy, still thin, but it was his again, not the city's. He shivered, then tucked his head under my chin, his nose pressing into my skin as though he had finally found a place safe enough to rest. I whispered into the damp towel, my voice breaking with the weight of it. "There you are. I can finally see you." And as I rocked him gently in my arms, I felt his tail flick once, then again, faint but certain. A small rhythm that told me he was beginning to believe it too. The days that followed blurred together, a rhythm of care and quiet victories that felt like lifelines. My apartment in Trastevere, once a place I came back to only for sleep between shifts, began to feel alive. The little French Bulldog, no longer just a bundle of bones and grime, was transforming before my eyes. His fur, though still thin in patches, had begun to shine in places where the dirt had once clung stubbornly. His ribs still showed, but he carried himself with more weight, more certainty. Each breath no longer sounded like a question. It sounded like life. He followed me now, padding across the floor with paws that had been cracked and stiff only days before. The first time he tottered after me from the blanket pile to the kitchen, my throat closed. He stumbled halfway, pausing to steady himself, then pushed forward until he reached my ankle, pressing his nose gently against it. A gesture so small, yet to me, it was the loudest declaration. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was choosing to live with me. At night, instead of curling in on himself in silent shivers, he nestled into the curve of my arm, sighing deeply, the sound of someone who had found rest for the first time. I lay awake sometimes, listening to the faint snuffles of his breathing, and thought of the first night I had found him half buried in the shadows. That memory haunted me, but it also gave me perspective. Each wag of his tail, each clumsy bite of food, each lick of water was a defiance of that darkness. One evening, as the bells of a nearby church tolled and the city glowed in shades of amber outside my window, I sat with him cradled in my lap. I ran a hand over his now clean fur, still uneven, but warm and soft under my palm. He looked up at me with eyes that no longer carried only fear. They held recognition now, and a fragile trust. It was then I knew it was time. "You need a name," I whispered. My voice trembled, not with doubt, but with the weight of what it meant. Names are belonging, a mark of being seen, of being part of something. I searched his face, the little folds around his muzzle, the way his ears tilted as if listening. "You've survived what no one should have to survive. You deserve a name that means strength." I brushed my thumb gently along his cheek, and the name settled in my heart before it reached my lips. Leo. At that sound, he wagged his tail, not faint, not uncertain, but a steady rhythm against my arm, strong enough to fill the silence of the room. I felt my chest break open with something beyond relief, beyond joy. In that moment, I knew. He was no longer a stray lost in the shadows. He was mine, and I was his. And in the quiet heartbeat that followed, with the city of Rome humming outside our window, I realized we had both been rescued,